An empath does not disappear because they are weak, dramatic, or unable to love deeply. They disappear because their nervous system has learned, often very early in life, that love requires self-erasure. For a long time they stay, they explain, they endure, they tolerate emotional inconsistency, subtle disrespect, unmet needs, and the quiet dismissal of their inner world. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. What finally makes an empath disappear is not one big betrayal, but the slow realization that staying requires abandoning themselves again and again. And when an empath chooses themselves for the first time, it can look like vanishing, but in truth it is a return. When an empath experiences chronic emotional invalidation, something very specific happens inside them, and it has little to do with weakness and everything to do with adaptation. Emotional invalidation is not always loud. It is not always cruelty or obvious neglect. More often, it is subtle. It is the sigh when they express a feeling, the shift in energy when they ask for reassurance, the quick change of subject when their pain enters the room. Over time, the empath learns a powerful lesson: their inner world is inconvenient. Their emotions are excessive. Their needs are something that must be managed alone if connection is to survive. From a trauma-informed perspective, this learning does not begin in adulthood. It is almost always rooted in early relationships where love was present but conditional. The child learns that to stay connected, they must stay agreeable, perceptive, attuned to others, and quiet about their own distress. This is how the empath is formed, not as a personality trait, but as a nervous system response. Hyper-awareness becomes safety. Sensitivity becomes strategy. Self-silencing becomes survival. So when an empath enters adult relationships, they do not immediately leave when invalidation appears. In fact, it often feels familiar. The body recognizes it before the mind questions it. They tell themselves they are being too sensitive. They over-explain. They search for better words, softer tones, more patience. They believe that if they can just translate their pain correctly, it will finally be understood. This is not irrational hope. It is conditioned hope. The same hope the child once held while waiting for emotional attunement that never fully arrived. But the nervous system keeps score. Each moment of dismissal creates a small internal fracture. Each unmet need reinforces the belief that connection requires self-erasure. The empath begins to feel tired in a way that rest does not fix. They feel lonely even while being loved. Their body tightens during conversations that should feel safe. Anxiety increases not because they are broken, but because their system is constantly scanning for emotional threat. At some point, something shifts. Not suddenly, not dramatically, often quietly. The empath realizes that the relationship requires them to disappear internally in order to stay externally. And this is where the deepest conflict arises. Because the empath's greatest fear is abandonment, but their deepest wound is self-abandonment. When the cost of staying becomes the loss of authenticity, the nervous system initiates withdrawal, not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as protection. This is why when an empath disappears, it often surprises the other person. They did not see the years of internal negotiation, the silent tolerance, the repeated overriding of intuition, the gradual shutting down of emotional availability. Detachment begins long before departure. By the time the empath leaves physically, they have already left emotionally, because the body made the decision before the mind found the language. Chronic emotional invalidation teaches the empath that their needs are unsafe to express, but healing begins when they recognize that this belief was learned, not innate. The moment an empath understands that connection should not require self-erasure, their tolerance for invalidation collapses. What once felt normal now feels intolerable, and from the outside it may look like disappearance, but from the inside, it feels like coming home to a self that was silenced for far too long. The empath stays, long after the bond becomes harmful, and this is often misunderstood as weakness or lack of self-respect, but it is neither. It is loyalty born from conditioning. It is endurance mistaken for love. The empath does not measure relationships by how they feel inside them, but by how much they can tolerate without leaving. This tolerance is not accidental. It is learned early, in environments where attachment mattered more than authenticity, and where leaving emotionally or physically was not an option. For the empath, leaving feels dangerous, not because the relationship is good, but because separation activates an old nervous system alarm. In childhood, connection may have been unpredictable, inconsistent, or emotionally costly. The child learned that staying close, even when hurt, was safer than risking abandonment. So the adult empath does the same. They stay through emotional neglect. They stay through boundary violations. They stay through cycles of hope and disappointment. They stay because their body equates endurance with survival. This is why empaths often become experts at minimizing their pain. They explain away what hurts them. They intellectualize mistreatment. They see the other person's wounds more clearly than their own. They understand why someone behaves the way they do, and they mistake that understanding for obligation. Compassion becomes a cage. Empathy turns inward as self-blame. If the relationship is painful, they assume they are failing at love, rather than recognizing that love is failing them. What keeps the empath attached is not the present relationship, but the past that is being replayed. Trauma does not repeat itself because it wants to hurt us, but because it wants resolution. The empath unconsciously hopes that this time, if they love better, stay longer, explain more clearly, they will finally be chosen without having to disappear. This hope is powerful. It keeps them invested long after joy has left the bond. Meanwhile, the body begins to protest. Sleep changes, energy drops, anxiety rises without a clear reason. The empath may feel numb, irritable, or chronically overwhelmed. These are not signs of emotional instability. They are signs of prolonged self-betrayal. The nervous system knows when a relationship is unsafe long before the mind is willing to accept it. But because the empath was taught to override inner signals in favor of connection, they ignore these messages and call it patience. The harm does not come from staying once. It comes from staying repeatedly while silencing the self. Each time the empath chooses the relationship over their own truth, something inside them withdraws. They become less expressive, less spontaneous, less alive. They give less not because they care less, but because there is less of them available to give. This is the slow erosion that precedes disappearance. Eventually, a threshold is crossed, not because the empath suddenly becomes strong, but because the cost of staying exceeds the cost of leaving. This moment is often quiet. There may be no argument, no final betrayal, no dramatic exit. Just a deep internal knowing that continuing would require further self-abandonment. And the body, having endured enough, withdraws consent. When the empath finally leaves, others may say it was sudden, unexpected, or unfair, but nothing about it was sudden. It was the result of staying too long, loving too hard, and abandoning the self too consistently. The leaving is not an act of rejection. It is an act of repair. A delayed response to years of internal damage that was never acknowledged out loud. If you want Keynote 3 next, just reply 3 childhood conditioning normalizes self-abandonment long before the empath has language for what is happening. The child does not wake up one day and decide to neglect themselves. They adapt. In homes where emotional needs were ignored, minimized, or treated as burdensome, the child learns that expressing discomfort threatens connection, so they begin to track the moods of others more closely than their own. They learn when to speak and when to stay quiet. They learn how to be easy, helpful, and emotionally self-sufficient, not because it is healthy, but because it is safe. This adaptation often looks like maturity. The empath is described as wise beyond their years, emotionally intelligent, unusually considerate. But beneath this praise is a nervous system that learned to suppress authentic needs in order to preserve attachment. The child's body absorbs a core message: who I am naturally is too much, and who I must become is less needy, less emotional, less demanding. Love becomes something to be earned through self-control rather than something to be received through presence. When this child grows into an adult, they do not recognize self-abandonment as harm. It feels normal. It feels like love. They choose partners and relationships where their emotional labor is required but rarely reciprocated. They are drawn to people who need understanding, patience, and forgiveness because these roles mirror the emotional dynamics of their childhood. Familiarity masquerades as chemistry. Intensity feels like connection. And the absence of attunement is tolerated because it has always been tolerated. The empath learns to leave themselves before anyone else has the chance to leave them. This is not conscious, it is a protective reflex. If I do not ask for too much, I will not be rejected. If I do not express anger, I will not lose love. If I adapt quickly enough, no one will abandon me. Over time, this creates an internal split. The empath becomes highly attuned to others while becoming increasingly disconnected from their own internal signals. This disconnection has a cost. The body does not forget what the mind rationalizes. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They transform into tension, fatigue, anxiety, and chronic self-doubt. The empath may struggle to identify what they want, because wanting was once dangerous. They may feel guilty for resting, asserting boundaries, or choosing themselves, because self-care was framed as selfishness early on. In relationships, this conditioning leads the empath to overfunction. They explain, accommodate, and forgive long past what is healthy. They stay silent to keep the peace. They take responsibility for emotional dynamics that do not belong to them. And because this pattern once ensured survival, it feels wrong to break it, even when it causes pain. Leaving a harmful relationship does not feel like relief at first. It feels like betrayal of an old survival contract. What changes is not the empath's capacity for love, but their awareness. At some point, often through exhaustion or awakening, they realize that self-abandonment is not virtue. That love should not require disappearance. That connection should not come at the cost of authenticity. This realization is destabilizing because it challenges the very strategy that once kept them safe. When the empath begins to reclaim themselves, others may experience it as distance or withdrawal. The empath speaks less because they no longer explain themselves into erasure. They give less because they are no longer over giving to feel worthy. They stop negotiating their boundaries because they finally understand that boundaries are not punishments, but protections. This is when disappearance begins, not as revenge, not as coldness, but as the natural consequence of a nervous system no longer willing to sacrifice itself for attachment. The empath does not leave to hurt anyone. They leave because staying would mean abandoning the child inside them all over again. Love becomes a survival strategy, rather than a choice when connection was once uncertain or emotionally costly. For the empath, love is not simply something that happens between two people in the present moment. It is something the nervous system organizes around. It is vigilance. It is effort. It is adaptation. When love is learned under conditions where emotional safety is inconsistent, the body associates closeness with danger and responsibility at the same time. The empath does not fall in love casually. They attach through usefulness, through understanding, through emotional labor. They learn that love is something you maintain by being attentive, forgiving, flexible, and endlessly patient. This is not romantic devotion. It is a survival response shaped by early experiences where love could be withdrawn, moods could shift suddenly, or emotional needs were met only when the child performed correctly. As a result, the empath confuses intensity with intimacy. They feel bonded through struggle. They feel close when they are needed. They feel secure when they are accommodating. Love is no longer a free exchange between two regulated nervous systems. It becomes a job, a role, a responsibility. The empath unconsciously believes that if they stop trying, the connection will collapse. And because abandonment once felt unbearable, they keep trying long after the relationship stops being nourishing. This is why empaths often remain in relationships where they feel anxious, unseen, or emotionally drained. The discomfort feels familiar. The effort feels meaningful. The suffering feels purposeful. Leaving does not feel like freedom, it feels like failure. Because when love is a survival strategy, losing it threatens the sense of safety itself, not just companionship. The body plays a central role here. Trauma lives in the nervous system, not in logic. Even when the empath understands intellectually that a relationship is harmful, their body reacts as if leaving could endanger their survival. Heart rate increases, guilt floods in, fear tightens the chest. These reactions are not signs of weakness. They are echoes of a time when connection truly was necessary for survival. Over time, however, the cost becomes undeniable. Loving as a strategy requires constant self-monitoring. The empath is always scanning for changes in tone, mood, or distance. They preemptively adjust to avoid conflict. They sacrifice spontaneity to maintain harmony. And slowly they lose access to their own needs, because needs threaten the very connection they are trying to preserve. This is where resentment quietly grows. Not outward resentment, but internal exhaustion. The empath begins to feel hollow. They love deeply, but they are not being met. They give generously, but they are not receiving. Their body carries the weight of an unspoken truth. This relationship requires me to disappear in order to survive it. When love stops being a choice, it stops being love. It becomes obligation. And the nervous system eventually rebels against obligation that causes harm. The empath may not recognize this rebellion consciously. It can show up as numbness, loss of attraction, or emotional shutdown. This is not indifference. It is the system protecting itself from further depletion. The turning point comes when the empath realizes that love was never meant to cost them their identity. That connection should not require constant self-suppression. That safety does not come from being indispensable, but from being authentic. This realization destabilizes the old survival strategy. The body begins to release its grip on relationships that require hypervigilance. From the outside, this looks like withdrawal, less explanation, less availability, less emotional overextension. But internally, something profound is happening. The empath is learning to experience love as a choice rather than a compulsion. And when a relationship cannot exist without the old strategy, it cannot survive the empath's healing. This is why disappearance often follows growth. When love is no longer used to regulate fear, relationships that depend on fear lose their hold. The empath does not disappear to punish anyone. They disappear because they no longer need to survive. Through attachment, the body signals danger before the mind understands. And this is especially true for empaths who were trained early to distrust their own perceptions. Long before the empath can articulate that something is wrong in a relationship, their body already knows. The stomach tightens during conversations that should feel safe. The chest feels heavy after interactions that appear loving on the surface. Fatigue settles in without a clear cause. These are not random sensations. They are messages from a nervous system that has learned to detect emotional threat beneath politeness, charm, or familiarity. Empaths are often disconnected from these signals because survival once required them to override bodily truth. As children, noticing discomfort did not lead to relief. It often led to disappointment, dismissal, or conflict. So the body learned to speak softly, while the mind learned to rationalize. The empath became skilled at explaining away tension, minimizing unease, and staying present even when the body was preparing to flee. In adulthood, this creates a dangerous split. The empath may say everything is fine while their nervous system is in a constant state of alert. They feel anxious around someone they love and call it passion. They feel drained after being needed and call it purpose. They feel restless, numb, or irritable and blame themselves rather than the relational environment. Because acknowledging the body's signals would require acknowledging that the relationship is unsafe, and that realization threatens attachment. The body does not use words. It uses sensations. It uses exhaustion, headaches, shallow breathing, disrupted sleep, loss of appetite, or sudden emotional shutdown. These responses are not failures of resilience. They are evidence of prolonged emotional strain. When boundaries are crossed repeatedly, even subtly, the nervous system shifts into protection mode. Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn are not conscious choices. They are biological responses to perceived danger. For the empath, fawning is common. They become more accommodating as their body becomes more distressed. They give more when they have less. They listen more when they feel unheard. This is not generosity, it is a stress response. And because it once preserved connection, the empath mistakes it for love. Eventually, the body escalates its signals. What began as mild discomfort turns into chronic anxiety or emotional numbness. The empath may lose interest in intimacy, creativity, or social connection. They may feel disconnected from joy. This is not depression in the traditional sense. It is the nervous system conserving energy in an environment it does not feel safe to engage with fully. What is crucial to understand is that the body withdraws before the person leaves. Emotional detachment is not a decision. It is a physiological process. When the nervous system determines that a relationship consistently threatens well-being, it reduces emotional investment to protect the organism. The empath may still show up physically, still communicate, still care, but something essential has already begun to shut down. This is why disappearance can seem sudden. The other person may only notice when the empath stops trying, stops explaining, stops accommodating. But by that time, the body has been signaling for a long time. The empath has been living in low-grade survival mode, often without realizing it, because survival once felt like normalcy. Healing begins when the empath learns to listen to the body instead of overriding it. When they recognize that discomfort is not betrayal, but information, that anxiety is not always a personal flaw, but sometimes a relational truth. This awareness does not immediately lead to leaving. Often it leads to grief. Grief for how long the body was ignored. Grief for how much pain was endured silently. When the empath finally trusts their body, their tolerance for unsafe dynamics collapses. They cannot unfeel what they now recognize. The nervous system will no longer allow prolonged exposure to emotional harm. And when the body withdraws its consent, the relationship loses its grip. This is the moment people call disappearance. But it is not vanishing. It is the body reclaiming its right to safety after years of being overridden in the name of love. Detachment happens internally long before it becomes visible, and this is why an empath's departure often feels shocking to those around them. What looks like sudden disappearance is actually the final stage of a long, quiet process that unfolded beneath the surface. The empath does not wake up one day and decide to stop caring. They begin withdrawing emotionally in small, almost imperceptible ways, usually while still showing up, still listening, still loving on the outside. This internal detachment begins when the empath realizes, consciously or unconsciously, that being fully present is no longer safe. Each time their feelings are dismissed, their boundaries crossed, or their needs minimized, a subtle contraction occurs. The empath feels it, but often ignores it. They tell themselves it is temporary. They give the benefit of the doubt. They hope that understanding will restore connection. But the nervous system is already adjusting. It is learning that openness leads to pain. So the empath adapts again. They share less, they stop bringing up what hurts them. They keep conversations light. They become agreeable, calm, and emotionally contained. This is not peace. It is protective distance. The empath is still there, but not all of them is there. A part has stepped back to avoid further injury. What makes this phase difficult to recognize is that it often looks like emotional maturity. The empath seems less reactive, less demanding, less intense. Conflict decreases, not because issues are resolved, but because the empath no longer feels safe addressing them. Silence replaces expression. Acceptance replaces hope. This is when the relationship feels stable to the other person, while it is quietly dissolving inside the empath. Detachment is not coldness. It is exhaustion. The empath has spent years explaining, accommodating, and attuning, and their system has reached its limit. They are no longer fighting for connection, because fighting itself has become a source of harm. The body chooses conservation over engagement. Energy once used to maintain the bond is redirected toward basic self-preservation. Internally, the empath grieves during this phase. They grieve the version of the relationship they believed in. They grieve the effort they invested. They grieve the hope that things would eventually feel mutual. This grief happens privately without announcement. By the time the empath leaves, much of the mourning is already complete. This is why explanations stop. The empath has already explained everything internally. They have already weighed the costs. They have already tried to make peace with staying, and found that peace impossible. Words begin to feel pointless, not because they lack insight, but because insight did not lead to change. Silence becomes a boundary when language has failed. From the outside, the empath's withdrawal may look like indifference or emotional shutdown. But internally, it is clarity. The empath finally sees the pattern without illusion. They recognize that the relationship requires ongoing self-betrayal. And once this recognition settles into the nervous system, re-engagement becomes impossible. The most important thing to understand is that detachment is not a strategy to punish or provoke change. It is not a test. It is not manipulation. It is the body and psyche aligning around a truth that can no longer be avoided. The empath is no longer willing to override themselves for the sake of connection. When the physical departure happens, it is almost anticlimactic. There is little drama, little anger. Often there is kindness, even compassion. But the emotional door has already closed. The empath is not protecting themselves from the other person anymore. They are protecting themselves for the first time. This is why once an empath disappears, they rarely return to the same dynamic. The internal detachment was thorough. It was not impulsive. It was built slowly, out of repeated moments where staying required self-neglect. And when the empath finally chooses themselves, the bond that depended on their self-abandonment no longer exists. Silence replaces explanation when self-respect awakens. And this shift is often misread as emotional withdrawal or indifference. For the empath, silence is not the absence of feeling. It is the end of self-betrayal through over-explaining. For a long time, the empath believed that if they could just find the right words, speak gently enough, or explain deeply enough, they would finally be understood. Explanation became their way of trying to earn safety. This habit is rooted in early experiences where emotional attunement was inconsistent. The child learned that being clear, calm, and reasonable increased the chances of being heard. So they became skilled communicators, not because communication was welcomed, but because misunderstanding felt dangerous. In adulthood, this translates into an empath who explains their pain carefully, patiently, repeatedly, hoping clarity will lead to care. But clarity does not heal environments that lack emotional responsibility. Over time, the empath begins to notice a painful pattern. Their explanations are heard, but not held. Their vulnerability is acknowledged, but not protected. Their words lead to temporary reassurance, but not lasting change. Each explanation costs energy. Each attempt requires reopening wounds that never fully heal. This is when silence begins to form, not as avoidance, but as discernment. The empath realizes that explaining themselves to someone who consistently dismisses or minimizes their experience is another form of self-abandonment. It keeps them emotionally exposed in a space that does not offer safety. Silence becomes the first boundary that does not require justification. This silence is not sudden. It follows many attempts to be understood. It emerges after the empath has tried honesty, patience, compassion, and compromise. When all of these fail to create mutual care, the empath stops translating their pain into language that goes nowhere. They begin to conserve their emotional energy. Silence also marks a shift in power dynamics. The empath no longer seeks validation from someone unwilling to provide it. They stop negotiating their worth. They stop pleading for empathy. This is not because they no longer need connection, but because they no longer accept connection that requires self-erasure. From the outside, this can feel confusing or even threatening. The other person may accuse the empath of shutting down or pulling away. But what is actually happening is self-respect is replacing hope. The empath is no longer trying to fix the relationship alone. They are no longer carrying the emotional weight for two people. Silence becomes a mirror. It reflects what is present and what is absent. Without explanation to soften reality, the truth becomes clear. If the relationship collapses in the absence of the empath's emotional labor, then it was sustained by that labor all along. This realization is painful, but it is also liberating. For the empath, choosing silence is not about winning or withholding. It is about dignity. It is about recognizing that being understood is not something you can force through effort. It requires willingness on both sides. When that willingness is missing, continued explanation only deepens the wound. This is why silence often precedes disappearance. Once the empath stops explaining, they begin to see the relationship as it truly is, not as they hoped it could be. The fantasy dissolves. The responsibility shifts back where it belongs. And without the empath's constant emotional translation, the connection loses its scaffolding. When self-respect awakens, the empath no longer needs to justify their withdrawal. They trust their internal knowing. They allow their actions to speak instead of their suffering. Silence is not the end of communication. It is the end of pleading for basic emotional care. Disappearing is not punishment. It is self-preservation. And this distinction is essential to understand the empath's final withdrawal. From the outside, disappearance can look harsh, avoidant, or even cruel. It may be interpreted as abandonment or emotional cutoff. But for the empath, leaving is rarely driven by anger or a desire to hurt. It is driven by the recognition that staying is actively causing harm. Empaths do not leave impulsively. They leave after enduring, after hoping, after giving more chances than were ever asked for. By the time disappearance happens, the empath has already exhausted every internal resource available to maintain the connection. They have tried understanding. They have tried patience. They have tried silence. They have tried explaining themselves into clarity. What remains is not rage, but clarity. Self-preservation emerges when the nervous system finally accepts a truth the heart resisted for a long time. This relationship cannot be healed without my continued self-abandonment. And the moment this truth settles into the body, staying becomes impossible. Not morally wrong, physiologically unsustainable. The body withdraws because it must. This is why disappearance often lacks drama. There may be no final confrontation, no emotional explosion, no attempt to make the other person understand. The empath has already reached understanding internally. They know that further conversation will not lead to safety, only to repetition, so they choose distance not as a tactic but as medicine. To someone unfamiliar with trauma-based attachment, this can feel unfair. They may say they deserved closure, explanation, another chance. But the empath has learned that closure does not come from dialogue with someone who cannot meet them emotionally. Closure comes from alignment between the mind, the body, and the self. Disappearing allows that alignment to happen. It is important to understand that the empath is not disappearing from love itself. They are disappearing from a dynamic that required them to shrink, silence, or override themselves. Their capacity for love remains intact. What changes is their tolerance for emotional harm. What ends is their willingness to confuse endurance with devotion. Self-preservation often brings grief. Even relief can coexist with sadness. The empath mourns what they wish the relationship could be. They mourn the parts of themselves that stayed too long. They mourn the hope that kept them invested. But this grief is clean. It does not require self-betrayal. It does not demand explanation. When an empath disappears, it is usually the first time they have chosen themselves without apology. And that choice can feel unfamiliar, even frightening. But it is also deeply regulating. The nervous system begins to settle. The body breathes more freely, energy returns. Not because the loss was easy, but because the danger has passed. This is why disappearance is often permanent. Not because the empath lacks compassion, but because they finally have compassion for themselves. Returning would require reopening a wound they worked hard to close. Returning would mean teaching the body that its boundaries are negotiable again. An empath does not disappear to teach someone a lesson. They disappear because the lesson has already been learned internally. That love without safety is not love. That connection without respect is not connection. And that staying where one must disappear internally is the deepest form of abandonment. So when an empath disappears, it is not the end of love. It is the end of self-erasure. It is the moment survival gives way to selfhood. It is the quiet decision to live in alignment rather than attachment. And once that decision is made, there is no need to be seen leaving, because the leaving is no longer about anyone else at all. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.